So again, welcome. Thanks for joining me for season 2 of Quarantine Historians, maybe or maybe not drinking coffee. And I thought we would start with, are you drinking coffee? What are you drinking? Should I ask? I mean, never mind.
I'm drinking tea. See, tea bag. I'm drinking tea.
You know, I've been adding to my collection. The one I have for this one is from a friend, and it says, "I wish I could text my cat."
That's almost tragic, but I know a lot of people who would probably love that.
Mm-hmm.
I know a lot of people who would love that.
Well, and I also, honestly, I think of you in Stackville when I think about my relationship with my cat, because I remember that sounds weird. That sounds weird, but let me explain. So when I started at Stackville, Oscar was there, and you were there, and when you left, you were like, "I'm taking Oscar. I've paid for his food, his vet bills. Like, this is my cat." I was like, I fully understand that. But then I thought, like, we need another cat for the site to help. You know, it really did help with the mice and the whole thing. So I went around trying to find a cat. SPCA was like, "Are you going to let it outside?" And I was like, "Well, yeah." And then they were like, no. So I actually got my current cat, Sophia, on Craigslist for Stackville, and she lived there for the 3.5 years I was there. And when I left, I thought to myself, I paid her vet bills, I paid her food, this is my cat. And so I took Sophia, and she is still with me to this day.
That's such a sweet story.
So if you want to talk a little bit about your background, and then we'll go from there.
Cool. So my name is Frachele Scott, and I'm currently the managing director of the Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice, located in Durham, North Carolina. And it is a recently established historic site. We plan to open the historic home, which I'm currently in charge of rehabilitating. We plan to open the historic home in 2021. The grounds will be open then as well. And from then, we'll have to open the Welcome Center in 2022. We have 3 phases of development, and so we are just in the first phase now with the completing the restoration of the historic home, Pauli Murray's historic home. And this is my 3rd historic site. I started at Historic Stackville, I want to say it was 2007 or 2006. Hard to say. I went as a volunteer. I'm a lawyer by training, and I was very stressed out and decided that I needed to give back. You know, because when you're stressed out and overwhelmed, they say to acts of service for others is an important outlet. And so I saw a listing for volunteers needed to work on an African American genealogy project. And at the time, that sounded like the right thing to do. Connecting African Americans in Durham to their historical roots seemed like a really important project. And so I drove out to the middle of nowhere and came upon this gate and this beautiful fence line, and drove down a dirt pathway, saw this house that didn't look anything like a plantation home that I was familiar with, and kept driving and got to the Welcome Center, where I was greeted by Diana Overby and Jennifer Farley, who was the site manager then, and they explained the project to me that, you know, Stackville had an extensive amount and access to extensive records on the enslaved population there, and it was a data entry. Basically, enter this data into Family Tree Maker, and that's what I did for a while. And they asked me to go on the tour, and so I to become familiar with the tour, so you get familiar with the content. I did. And then for some reason or another, I had to give a tour. And that wasn't part of the deal. That was never part of the deal. But I gave a tour, and it was really fun. It was fun. That's all I can say, is that it was a fun opportunity, and I was good at it. My guests really enjoyed my tour. I think it was deeply empowering to be able to talk about African American history as an African American, and that changes the dynamic altogether. And so it wasn't too long after that. Maybe I did a 4-month stint as a volunteer, and then they gave me a little pocket change as a temporary part-time. There was, in state government, sometimes you have lapsed salary money, and so there was some lapsed salary. So they gave me a little money to volunteer, and then Jennifer left to go to Duke Homestead to become the manager, and there was this position open, but Diana Overby was there, and she was a rock star. She was brilliant, and it was never, ever weird. We both knew we were applying for the position. We both wanted it, and it was never weird. Like, that's the kind of collegial attitude we brought to Stackville. I think Stackville is special in that way. There's never competition. People just care about telling the story. And so I applied for that job as the site manager, got it. So I went from volunteer to site manager in about a 6-month period.
Gosh. I didn't realize it was that short of a window.
Yeah, it was really short. It was really short. It was really short. And I stayed at Stackville for, I want to say, just shy of 2 years, maybe 18 months. And it was the best time ever. It really was. They always say your first sight is your favorite. It's the one that's always in your heart. But Stackville is just a special place. And I think it has a special place in African American identity, and in the racial dynamics that we experience across the American South, and the way in which we approached those tough topics in an academic but still empathetic kind of way, an honest way. It was a special experience. But from there, I went to the Charlotte Hawkins Brown Museum, still within the North Carolina State Historic Sites system. That was also a beautiful experience because it was a school campus. And I remember during my interview telling the then regional director and manager that I'd always wanted to have my own school. And so we never know how the universe is going to bring us things, but this was me having my own school. Here you go, Frachele, an entire campus. And so I had an older staff. I was inheriting an established staff there, and they were able to teach me things that I wouldn't have known about exhibits, like hanging exhibits, and calculating linear space and all manner of things, and about a lot of things about construction. And that's where I got my teeth wet really on the construction and historic preservation, because there were several projects that were ongoing when I got there and several more that were slated while I was there. And so I forget how many millions of dollars of construction, but we rehabilitated a 1920s dining hall, one of the cottages, put in brand new infrastructure for the entire campus, water and sewer. And it was massive. And then once you got the jobs done, it's like, okay, now interpret it. And by that time, we had this new crop of trained public historians coming into the field, and they had been trained and were conversant in history in a way that their predecessors were less so. I think there's a way that history has been taught in America, and there are topics that you just don't touch. And this new wave of public historians coming out, they were unafraid. And so they understood intersectionality and the importance of talking about all the dynamics that were in play. And so we began to really explore Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown, her personal life, as opposed to holding her up as just this historic figure who did all of this myriad, had this myriad of accomplishments. It was now about talking about her personal life and understanding the ways in which she was navigating society and why she was navigating society in that way. And that was a breath of fresh air. And then the staff sort of collectively had other opportunities, and we moved on. And I went into the practice of law exclusively for about 18 months. And I was at a conference doing with Brandy Raggianti and Renee Donnell, who had also been at the Charlotte Hawkins Brown Museum. We were at the State and Local History Conference down in Austin. We had, by that point, we had all left historic sites, but we had won the invitation to this conference. We all scraped together our own pennies and flew ourselves down there to present at this conference, where there were members of the Pauli Murray Center staff and board of directors in the audience, and they said, "We had no idea that you had left historic sites. We need a lawyer. Will you be our lawyer?" And I'm like, "Oh yeah, we can talk about it, sure." You know, because people at conferences approach you all the time, and we exchange cards. It's not a big deal. But I had no idea that they would follow up and follow up and follow up. And so I went on board first with Pauli Murray Center as general counsel, and it was wonderful. And so that is the roundabout. I started as a volunteer for historic sites and ended or have landed as managing director of this really progressive, innovative historic site. And I couldn't be happier.
Great. Like, has your law degree helped you? How has it helped you in the public history world and vice versa?
So what I say about law school all the time is that it teaches you how to think. It teaches you how to present, how to develop, and then how to present a compelling, persuasive argument. And there's a way that law school gives you challenging questions, and it's your job to sort of maintain a calm exterior, answer the question, provide any follow-up information, and sometimes say, "You know what, I don't know the answer. I'm gonna have to research that," to your client, because sometimes legal questions are complex. So it's two levels. There's the introductory level or the baseline level, which is how do you interact with people who are coming with questions? How do you present a narrative to them, a narrative that they may be unfamiliar with, or a narrative that is challenging to their ideas already? How do you present that? And I think that my legal background helps me to present a compelling argument. We don't make it up. We do not make up the historical record. We rely on the primary source material, and when which is in my world, that would be considered evidence. So when you've got the evidence to present to people, that helps so much. They may still not want to accept it, but you've at least planted the seed of, maybe. And that's good enough for me. And then when you carry that the next step in terms of like the management of a historic site, you should know a little bit, especially with the work that I've done primarily, you should know a little bit about construction law and about contracts. You should know a little bit about the First Amendment, because people want to put signs and they want to do things on their publicly funded historic sites. And so you've got to be able to navigate that with some degree of savvy. And I'm not sure that people enter the public history field thinking about ways in which they're going to have to interact with their guests and with visitors, and when they're going to be challenged by visitors. You think, "Oh, Van's birthplace, can't wait to tell this story, and no one's ever come in and challenge it." Like, no, that's not real at all. Some people seek you out just to challenge the narrative that's on your website. That's why they're there. And you've got to handle that with grace and decorum. And so I feel like the legal profession prepares you to handle the opposition or opposing viewpoints in a way that is not confrontational, aggressive, or antagonistic. You pull in and you give the facts that are in evidence. You provide what you know, and you say, "I don't know" sometimes. So I think there's a strong overlap. I'm glad that I had my legal training, or I might have been one of those people that was like, "You don't know what you're talking about. No, the books are wrong. The history books are wrong. They were written by white supremacists. No, you know what you're talking about." I could have been one of those people, but no, pull it back in. There's scenarios that you can sort of help young professionals plan for. So I remember in my early days at Stackville, I was still volunteer status, maybe part-time, I don't remember. But I had gone on a tour with this lovely older white couple. And we were in the Benahan house. We had just gotten to the dining room, which means that we were early in the tour. We were very early in the tour. We're not more than 15 minutes in when the gentleman began to drop the N-word and make references to the N-words, and that he was drawing back to Jews and in Israel and Africa, and just it was that face you're making right now, like, because you're sort of like, what just happened? I don't know what you're talking about, but I just heard the N-word on a tour. I didn't say it. My guest did. What's supposed to happen now? Am I supposed to go to the kitchen and continue this tour? Like, what do I do now? Because no one prepares you for that out of control, aggressive, abusive guest. And I finished the tour. The whole thing, down to the Great Barn and all. I am so shaken by the incident, because it's a word that I don't use it, and it's a word that I don't hear used in my circles, and so to hear it in my place of work was weird. And I went back to the visitor center and I was telling Jennifer and Diana what happened, and Jennifer was like, "What happened?" And she was like, you can end a tour, Frachele. If you ever feel uncomfortable, you can end a tour. Like, you didn't have to finish it. Like, that wasn't, what happened wasn't okay. And I think that public historians are they're so moved by the stories of their sites, and they want to tell the story, that they'll push through to make sure that the story is told regardless of the circumstances. We're out there in the rain, cold, it doesn't matter. We're going to get the job done. And sometimes that's at the expense of a bad experience, of a soul crushing kind of experience. And so I think we've got to do a good job of explaining to people that are entering the profession, hey, here's where the boundaries are in general, and you can create some other boundaries so that you feel safe on tour. You know how Stackville was very isolated, and so there's some sites are isolated. I mean, Vance Birthplace is an isolated site, and so you need to make sure that, I think we need to make sure that the young professionals are aware that it's okay to set limits.
For anyone watching this, I tell everyone, I'm like, you gave me my first start in the field, so thank you.
You were a great candidate. You were going to be a great addition to the field. I knew that.
Something that's hard is the terminology that's used. So, we call them historic interpreters or this or that. And I'm like, well, I was functioning as the assistant site manager, but my title was historic interpreter. And I remember when I went into that interview, I thought Betsy, who was the historic interpreter at the time, but in essence, your assistant site manager, I thought she was still there. So when I came in for the interview, When that interview started, because I was in my early 20s, I just finished grad school. Like, I didn't know really fully understand what historic interpreter 2 meant. Like, I thought I was going to be like a tour guide from the job description. No, I went in and like within the first 10 minutes, so I'm all prepared, right? Which is probably why I did good in that interview, because I was like, I'm like overqualified for a tour guide, you know? So I'm like answering all the questions. And then a little ways in, I'm like, oh my God, I'm not interviewing for an interpreter position. I'm interviewing for Betsy's job.
Right. We're just
Betsy's gone.
It's the bait and switch. It's not okay. It's what happened. Whatever. You got the job. You did great. Whatever.
I was like, wait.
Yes. And I think, I mean, there's so many hats, especially in historic sites. There's so many hats, and in the museum field, let's just be real. There's so many hats that one individual is wearing. You had to know a little bit about everything. You had a couple of people in law that you could call for reinforcements, but they were stretched super thin as well. And so you ended up learning a lot on the job. And so wearing multiple hats for me was beneficial, because I learned the financial system and how it worked, this large sort of institutional budget. I learned how that worked. I learned how the bid process worked when it comes to getting construction jobs done that the craftsmen couldn't do. I did learn more about interpretation and about when and how you reinterpret, and what kind of peer review and what kind of standards need to be in place when you're trying to expand interpretation. There's so many, because we were wearing so many hats, I feel like I learned a lot. Was it fair to have one person wearing 3 and 4 hats? Probably not. And that's what I mean. Take care of yourself, because that is a recipe for burnout. So the Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice, so we've got some outside installations, so you can read some waysides that you can read. But while the house isn't open, and so in my mind, that means, or I thought that meant sort of a slower visitor programming sort of cycle. But that's not at all what that means. So there's a lot of planning, and you would have thought that even with COVID, there'd be less going on. But I feel like there was so much more, and there was a learning curve of virtual programming. But we spent, June and July in intense planning mode for virtual programming. And then by August, we were starting our first series of virtual programs. And so that continued. Our last program is tomorrow, but we've done virtual programs basically every week this entire COVID season. And so that quiet time is what we call it. The quiet time is absolutely necessary, because for me, the question now, especially as we've been in this pandemic, is, oh, wow, we did programming that reached over, I think it was over 5,000 people. I want to say either 5,000 people attended our virtual programs, and then we had a reach of like 50,000 via Facebook who came back to click on parts of our virtual programming. I mean, it was a good number for a relatively, a startup site, if you will.
Right.
But it's like, what was the actual cost, the physical toll, the emotional and mental toll on members of the organization to get to those numbers? I was curious about how state historic sites were going to manage closed sites. And I know that actual visitors on site is a number that matters when it comes to funding. And there's a lot at play when there are no visitors on your site. There are lots of things that change. And so how did you all handle that, Kimberly?
Before we even officially shut down in March of 2020, and not shut down, but just suspended operations. I mean, our site was still open. People could still come to the grounds, and people use our site as a park all the time. We're right off the Blue Ridge Parkway. We have a picnic shelter. People come walk their dogs there. So it was like the site wasn't closed. It's just we weren't giving tours, and you couldn't access inside the visitor center. But when I saw what was coming, I had an inkling that we were going to be potentially shut down. I immediately started making lists of like, what are all the programs that we are currently doing that we can take virtual?
Mm-hmm.
Immediate. Like I was making a list and I'm calling, my assistant site manager, Lauren, and I'm like, I have all these ideas. And she's like, oh, me too. I was thinking about this and I have all these ideas. And we just immediately started planning. So, we shut down that week, and that week we had virtual programs.
Awesome.
So it was very quick. So I will say, it felt very like we were scrambling and moving really quickly. So it was one of those things where we're learning about the resources and learning about the virtual programming and having to do it at the same time was intense. Yeah. Everybody else is dealing with the same thing. So I'm emailing my boss, Jennifer, and saying, hey, here's what we're doing at Vance. I think this list might be helpful for other sites as well. And then it kind of morphed into a conversation, and our director, Michelle Lanier, decided that she wanted to create a digital engagement committee to kind of have a space where you could bring representatives from across the state and start connecting more, because there's a lot of really good positives with virtual programming, but it does, what does that mean as far as numbers? How do you count that? So, for behind the scenes, those numbers get counted as offsite visitation. But it's not really, we held our folk festival, the staff were on site doing programming, that got counted as offsite visitation. But, in my mind, offsite visitation is when I'm going to a festival and I'm taking a program somewhere else. So I'm interested to see what long-term impact that has internally for us. It did get to a point where I had to stop. I think it was July. And I said to Lauren, my assistant manager, I was like, I am feeling really overwhelmed and burned out. So I know that you've got to be feeling it probably too. And so let's just take a deep breath and let's sit down and talk about, we've been just go. When are we going to stop in phases and starting to open up a little bit more of our visitor center and start opening up certain parts? And I'm like, I can't maintain this virtual programming and the in-person that I was doing before. So what is that balance?
That there are definitely some elements of this that we're going to keep, and knowing how to strike the balance between what we keep as in-person programming and what we keep as digital programming when all of this is over. That's the question we haven't answered yet. But I'm so relieved, I guess, to hear that other sites were functioning just like we were, which is, all right, let's all scramble. We're going to keep doing this. We're just I haven't heard anyone say, well, we're going to do a study first and see what other folks are doing. No one has said that. Everyone was like, okay, let's get on it. We've got, which platforms do we have? How many followers? What are the capabilities on those platforms? Everybody just sort of jumped head first into the deep end and figured it out, tread water, everyone figured it out as they were doing it. I haven't heard anyone say, we're going to rot it out until we can go back to doing what we normally do. That wasn't, and so I think that's something that is unique, I think, to the public history field. There's such a desire to be good stewards of both the site and the historic story that you're telling, that the need to tell the story doesn't go away. That desire to tell the story doesn't go away. The mechanism, the tools that we use to tell the story, that changed, but not the desire to. No one, I don't think I talked to anyone in the public history field who saw COVID as a vacation. I know many people, many other industries who are on coronation, and public historians were not on coronation. They were still putting out content.
All the virtual programming that was happening. On top of that, I think the added, as you mentioned earlier, the social unrest and the cultural unrest that's happening, throughout the year, I know has greatly impacted the staff and what we do on a daily basis. I should say what we've been able to do at Vance. So I'm interested to know, how that has impacted what you're working on with the Pauli Murray Center.
So I think one of the best things about the position that I'm in now is that there is an organizational culture where we're expected to be responsible, but responsive to what's happening in society. And so we had a series of conversations that addressed some of those social issues because our historic figure, Pauli Murray, worked in social justice and was an activist, and she was a legal scholar. So we have we have a connection to having these types of conversations. There's a historical basis for having those types of conversations, but we were able to bring in speakers who were either involved as activists or were senators, state representatives now, to have these conversations with us, allowing questions from the public via the platforms that we were using. And it was the importance of dialogue, I think, is critical to race relations in America. I think dialogue is really important to our social fabric. There are strong cultural divides that we are seeing every day on television, on our evening news, that's on our news feeds. We are inundated with all of the ways that we are divided in America. And so but what we're not seeing are the conversations between opposing viewpoints. We don't see that happening. And we don't necessarily see platforms where people are having thoughtful conversations about how we got here. And so I think that the Pauli Murray Center, we're uniquely positioned because of the historical figure. We're uniquely positioned to have those conversations, to engage those dialogues, to invite others to ask questions. And that's the most, and I feel and have long felt that that's the most important feature of a public history site. Here's the narrative, here's the story. Ask me some questions. Challenge me if you challenge me, so we can all together have a better understanding of our shared American story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wow. I think that has definitely been a change kind of in the field that I've even noticed in the last probably, 10 years since, is that, when I was in grad school, I feel like there was still kind of this idea that museums were neutral spaces, that like even when I was starting, at Stackville, it was like, I felt like people shouldn't know my opinion, right? And I think there is still an element to that. Like there's a balance, but if you go too neutral, then I think it makes it hard for people to connect to the story and what you're saying, because you're not giving anything back.
The things I think Pauli Murray Center does really well is while we utilize the academics, absolutely, and the historians, we absolutely utilize them. We also bring to the table the members of the community. That's not unusual. Like we have a round table that has got 10 people in it, then at least 2 of them are going to be representing the community. Mm-hmm. And it's almost, from my perspective, it's almost as though when we put everyone on equal footing and tell the members of the community that we actually do want to hear from you, and we're showing you that we want to hear from you by having you in the same room at the same table with these scholars, because we all hold up the scholars. Like, no, we're leveling the playing field. Everyone's input is valued here. That's one of the ways in which we've been able to build community trust. But I totally get you. Like, if people don't trust your narrative to begin with, then they're always going to be nitpicking it and looking for your errors and not supporting and looking for the exceptions to the rule, to the narrative that you're perpetuating. And we also know we just can't, like, some folks we're not going to be able to reach, and we let it go, knowing that we're still doing the public service that we should be doing. I know it's hard. The ability to interact with the public is a necessary job requirement, even for the academics. You've got to be able to speak in a way that the public will understand, that lay people will understand, and getting to the psychology of why are people holding these beliefs? What is the fear that has to be confronted or released in order for them to allow for your narrative to be potentially true? Like, you've got to understand the core, and being able to read people from the moment they get out of the car, like how they stand and look at your visitor center. Like, you've got to be an observer of people, and then you've also got to be really genuine when you open the door and you greet them. That greet becomes super important. That first initial contact becomes important for both you and the visitor. It gives you your first opportunity to try to figure out, who are you dealing with? How'd you find us? What brings you by? Like, all of those sort of intro questions are really psychological questions. Mm-hmm. What initiated your visit? And then that lets me know how to proceed. I don't teach you that. I don't think they teach you what those intro questions are really designed to do, and what kind of intro questions will solicit what kind of information that will be beneficial to you as you continue throughout your tour.
Our interns, whoever it is, when they're brand new, we have them sit at the desk, and I will walk in the visitor center 6-7 different times and have them greet me, and I will do to them what the visitors typically do to us.
Excellent. And then I'm like, absolutely, that is excellent training.
And I don't tell them what I'm going to do, but I will, like, and I'll do this thing. One thing that happens all the time at Vance, I don't remember this happening at Stackville, but our door, when you open it, it dings, and people will, like, kind of open the door and then pause and, like, look around, and then open the door and then pause and look around, and then open the door and then pause, and I'm like, and it's literally like, ding, ding, and you're like, hi, oh, and you're like, I'm just gonna walk in and it's awkward because you're standing there and you're like, and you don't want to be, like, too awkward, so you're just like, I'm gonna pretend like I'm writing something.
I look like I'm busy right now.
I would love to hear if you have your most positive memory, or interesting, I don't know, you can decide, story about, an interaction that you've had. It doesn't have to be with a visitor, it can be with staff, whatever, with historic sites.
Oh my gosh, I have so many. I have more.
You can tell more than one.
Yeah, I have more positive interactions with both staff and visitors than I do weird stories. So for me, both sites the Stackville had living descendants of the enslaved population, and then at Charlotte Hawkins Brown Museum at Palmer Memorial Institute, which was a historically Black school, private school, they still have living graduates of Palmer. And so at both sites, I got to interact with people who had direct connection to my historic site. And I know we're not supposed to say my historic site, but that's how I felt about the historic sites. They were mine. They were, and so I remember, this is when I was still a volunteer, and at Stackville, the descendants were having a reunion, or excuse me, there was a family reunion coming through, and it happened to be that many of them were were descendants. And so I could see the family names. And at that time we had the family tree was on one of the walls.
Right.
And so I could connect people's names or family names, like, oh, let me show you. This is, what's your name? Okay. And try to like do the number of generations removed. There was so much information about individuals who had been enslaved at Stackville that you could actually say your family member's job was, and they lived here, and you could see there was a pride. They're like, you know my family. And when people are telling you positive things about your family, whether you knew the individuals or whether the family member knew the individuals or not, there's a sense of pride that you could see, head coming up, shoulders going back. Like my family member made history. It was an important part of history. And that was probably when I was sold on, this is what I actually want to do. Again, that was when I was still a volunteer, and I remember that, and it was so very powerful for me. And then at CHB, when the Palmerites, what they were called, when they would come and they would see the improvements that were happening to their campus, to their beloved alma mater, and you could go through their yearbooks and see who they were at 16. Now they were 60 or 70 or 80 years old, but you could see them return, their faces would return to their 16-year-old selves as they told their stories. And so that's still meaningful to me. I had the pleasure of some of the best teams. I worked with some of the best teams, and you, Diana Overby, Betsy, Brandy, I had the best people around me, and that extended to other site managers. Rich Thompson over at Town Creek, he's one of the best in the business. He's very low key, and he won't tell you that he's one of the best in the business. But if you ever go watch Rich handle by himself school group of 50, and keep a group of 50 fourth graders interested in what you're saying about these mounds, Rich does a fabulous job. And so I just worked with really amazing people who loved their work. And you can tell a difference when people are doing their job and when people love their work. And I just I have amazing memories of my time with historic sites. Like I said, I have more positive stories than I do anything else. I thought that my interactions with the public, I loved working with school kids. I loved when they could make a connection. I remember very poignantly a group of middle schoolers there in Durham at Stackville, and it was a class that self-segregated. So the black students were standing here, the white students were standing here, and the Latinx students were standing here. And we got to the slave quarters, to Horton Grove, and I'm talking about what life would have been like. And the Latino students are answering the questions around what do you think it would have been like for a newly freed person to be out in the world. And they're talking about the ways in which people are discriminated on the basis of their skin or how they talk. And and the white students are looking and listening. And then they're just, in that moment, there seemed to be a compassion and an empathy because the groups could see historic behaviors being reflected in modern day America. And that was deeply moving. I can't, it's one of those you almost have to be there for it, I guess, Kimberly. I'm probably not doing a good job of explaining it, but you could see connections happening. And when you see connections happening in middle schoolers, you know that they're going to be different when they leave your site. They're going to interact with each other differently when they leave your site. And that matters. Like that's the whole point, is that we are able to impart and educate the public in a way that impacts them, such that when they leave your site, they respond differently to the world. That's how I see it. So it was a very good run with historic sites, and I remain grateful to the folks who gave me a chance, who gave me my first job into a world that would become a passionate endeavor for me, and be sitting pretty at the Pauli Murray Center now, and taking all of the structure of historic sites, the great value that structure brings, being able to bring that to the table as we begin this really innovative, revolutionary kind of historic site experience at the Pauli Murray Center. Like, living the dream, Kimberly, living the dream.
Oh man, the way you worded that, I think you explained it perfectly. I think it's one of those things. Yes, I try to make sure I give a school group every once in a while, because, you know, you get pulled away as a site manager doing so many other things. And it's like, sometimes you forget why you went into the field in the first place, because you're filling out reports and all these things. And so I'll go do a school group now and again and remember why, because the kids, man.
Kimberly, this has been a fun conversation. Thank you for allowing me to take some steps down memory lane. Because I do remember you as a young professional, and I remember that interview, and you did rock the interview. There was no doubt who the first choice was, and you rose to the occasion. And I know that I left you at Stackville 2 months after hiring you. I left, and you know, I mean, in such situations, you have no choice but to be a rock star, and you are. There we go. Bam. You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to shine.
Easily.
Oh my gosh. Yes. Thank you so much for your time. And we'll have to do it again. I'll bring you back for season 3.
Yay. I would love that. Thanks.
All right. See you later.
See ya. Bye.
Bye.